I don't know any Jew or Christian who doesn't deny chapters in Leviticus. You would have to start, wouldn't you, by saying, well, the authoritative books and collections of Bukhari Hadith of Muhammad are not gay liberation documents, any more than they're women's liberation documents.
You are going to watch Douglas Murray brutally humiliate the Oxford student with truth about Islam. During a live debate, a young, naive student thought she could challenge Murray on Islam, but she was in for a rude awakening. Murray first unleashed a torrent of truths about Muhammad, Sharia law, and Islam's contentious history, leaving the audience astounded and the girl rendered speechless. This captivating verbal takedown is not to be missed. First, let's hear Douglas's spectacular speech.
What is Islam? We've had a lot of talk already tonight about it, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm very unlikely to be able to give you a comprehensive definition. If you listen to Zach, Muhammad, who founded Islam, was a sort of prototype of a just especially benevolent town councillor in the region of Fife. If you listened to him, you would get the impression that it was a pure arrangement of a few minimal issues of governance and so on. Now that isn't the case. Islam is many, many things. It's many complex things. It's not easy to sum it up. It is a religion, however, and it is possible to sum it up to some extent.
Now listen carefully as Douglas threw some important one.
My own favorite definition is that there are, in essence, three Islams. There is the Islam of the origins, that is the texts, the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings, and indeed the early lives of Muhammad. There is the second Islam, the way in which that has been extrapolated out over the centuries in the body of law known as the Sharia. And there is a third Islam that we often mean when we talk about Islam, which is what do Muslims believe? How do Muslims live?
Douglas Murray articulates a nuanced perspective on Islam, delineating it into three distinct realms. Firstly, he speaks of the Islam of origins, rooted in its foundational texts, the Quran and the Hadith. Secondly, he identifies the Islam of Sharia, which is the body of law that has developed over centuries from these sacred texts. Lastly, he describes the lived Islam, referring to the everyday beliefs and practices of Muslims. Then, he hits the nail.
Now, these are very, very deep waters, but there isn't any point in seeing deep waters unless you plunge straight in. Zach said in his comments that we must return to Islam's religious values. But the problem is that Zach's version of Islam's religious values is going to be very different from a lot of other people's. And let me put this point to you at its hardest, but I think it's necessary and it's truthful. Groups like ISIS have the worst possible interpretation of Islam. It should go without saying. But they have the worst possible interpretation of Islam for Muslims and for non-Muslims. However, it is an interpretation of the texts that they have. It is a valid interpretation of the lessons they take from the life of Muhammad. It is a possible interpretation of the texts and traditions they have in front of them. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that Muhammad was not Buddha.
Now, Douglas makes a strong point. The existence of violent interpretations of Islamic texts, such as those espoused by ISIS, highlights the challenge within Islam. The historical actions of Muhammad, who was a warrior and warlord, provide a basis for such interpretations, unlike the purely peaceful teachings of Buddha or Jesus.
Consider the history of Islam, of Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. The history of Christianity, goodness knows, has been bloody. Would it have been more bloody or less bloody if on even one occasion, when one of Jesus' disciples comes to him and says, how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times or 70 times 7. If instead of saying forgive him endlessly, which is what Jesus ends up saying, he'd have said chop off his head. What would have happened to the history of Christianity if even on one occasion when a woman is brought to Jesus found in adultery, instead of saying he who is without sin casts the first stone, said stone her? I think we can all agree, we should all be able to agree, in a place like this, the history of Christianity would have been bloodier. So it is with Islam. And I know that in a house like this, in this particular era, it's necessary to pretend that some people believe in Christianity, some people believe in Islam, some people do yoga, and that there isn't very much difference between them. There is, ladies and gentlemen. The origins matter.
Then Douglas uses a historical analogy to highlight the importance of the founding teachings of a religion, where on one hand, there are peaceful teachings of Jesus, and on the other, there are violent actions of Muhammad which clearly underscore the inherent differences. And he rightly said origins matter. Now get back to Douglas, where he continuously hit them with the hard facts.
But let me tell you some facts that should interest this House about what Muslims think. And I'm not going to go to Saudi Arabia. I don't need to go to Saudi Arabia. I don't need to go to the Gulf states. I don't need to go to Iran. I'll just use the opinions of Muslims in Britain. So here we go. Here's one. It's generally agreed that the modern liberal state includes the right of sexual minorities to live their lives and find love as they wish. A Gallup poll carried out here in the UK in 2009 found that 0% of British Muslims think that homosexuality is acceptable. 0. An ICM poll carried out last year found that 52% of British Muslims think that homosexuality should be made illegal. 52% of British Muslims last year. A YouGov poll from 2015 found that, nationwide in Britain, about 16% of the population think that homosexuality is morally wrong, but that raised to 29% in London. Why would that be? I leave you to ponder.
Then after all this, people really believe Islam is compatible with Western liberalism. What a big joke, I must say, and Douglas does not stop here.
Free speech is also, I think, widely agreed, certainly in Professor Borkstein's country, to be an important element in liberalism. So let's consider that one. Channel 4, in 2006, another notorious right-wing conspiracy, Channel 4. Channel 4 in 2006 found that 78% of British Muslims thought that the publishers of the Danish cartoons should be prosecuted. 78%. A BBC poll in 2015 found that 27% of British Muslims had, quote, some sympathy, end quote, for the people who went into the offices of Charlie Hebdo and killed the cartoonists, editors, and journalists there. Channel 4 poll from last year found that only 1% of UK Muslims think that publications should have the right to publish cartoons of Muhammad.
Now, after this brutal and honest, Douglas puts something many of us cannot even think of. Let's hear.
So the subject of women's come up already tonight, but I'll just give you one figure. A poll carried out last year, also by Channel 4, found that nationwide 5% of the British population agree with the phrase that wives should, quote, always obey their husbands. 5% across the country. However, 39% of British Muslims agree with that phrase.
I think you all must have got what I just said. Let's face what Islam thinks by the term obey is just another word for slavery. And I truly feel disgusted at such mentality. Now, let's back to Douglas, where he points an example.
Give me one other quick example. This isn't a figure. This is a quote from an eminent opponent of mine called Mehdi Hassan, a British Muslim journalist. Mehdi Hassan, on the subject of anti-Semitism within Britain's Muslim communities, wrote the following in 2013. It pains me to have to admit this, but anti-Semitism isn't just tolerated in some sections of the British Muslim community, it is routine and commonplace. Any Muslims reading this article will know what I'm referring to. It is, he said, quote, our dirty little secret.
Further, Douglas Murray captivates by highlighting the stark contrast between Western liberalism and Islamic practices, urging candid reflection on historical and contemporary challenges posed by Sharia law and societal integration. And then, when Douglas said something we all must seriously ponder on, lead here carefully, and I urge, think once.
And you see, that is the big problem of this debate tonight. Because if the other side tonight is right, and Islam is perfectly compatible with Western liberalism, then it's all going to be fine. But if they're wrong, our society is screwed. We are taking part in an article of blind faith and putting our future in the hands of a combustible religion that denies what is at its roots, even whilst pretending it has other things going on. That is, I would argue, the worst possible situation for a liberal society to be in. So I know why tonight you will feel, and rightly feel, that it would be good to walk through this side of the house, to say that Islam is perfectly compatible with Western liberalism and to take part in that pretense. But I would argue that you should go through this side or down the middle, because this whole thing is up for grabs. It could all yet go very much worse than it's already gone. And the one thing that we can say with certainty is that if we avoid all the difficult parts of this argument and fall for the kumbaya version of Islam rather than looking at it ourselves, then the future of Islam, of Muslims, of British Muslims, European Muslims, and of those of us who are not Muslim is going to go very badly wrong indeed in the years ahead. So thank you.
The lady takes the floor, confident enough she will put Douglas in his place and leave him at a loss for words, but I must assure you she was gravely mistaken.
Hello. For my dedication, can I just ask 2 questions, please?
Yeah,
so the first question I wanted to ask is, to what extent do you distinguish between how a term can be defined and the worst form of interpretation? So, for example, if I say, and I admire the fact that I support a secular state, does that mean I should advocate the worst interpretation of secularism, such as becoming supporting Soviet Union?
On which, watch out, Douglas' epic response.
But thank you for persevering. On the first of those things, no. I think that actually what the other side, by the way, did this evening was actually to essentialize Western culture. We hear a lot about the essentializing of Islam, very little about the essentializing of our culture. Immediately, Tariq Ramadan and others go on to colonialism and so on. It's as if the history of countries like ours is only one of colonialism. It's as if the rest of what we've achieved is as nothing.
Now here it is important to note that he points out how the opposition reduces Western culture to just its colonial history, ignoring its other achievements. He implied that just as it is unfair to essentialize Western culture in such a narrow way, and indeed, the other side in the debate digressed by pointing out colonization, and I asked them one important question to mull over: is really colonialism was just a Western thing? What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history, but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with this? Now, let's back to second question.
Second question I want to ask is, to what extent would you distinguish, as you rightly say, British Muslims being very anti-homosexual, as being following tribal cultures from South Asia, or because we know that that type of idea of killing homosexuality, being anti-homosexual, is not just restricted to Muslims in South Asia, but also Hindus in South Asia, Sikhs in South Asia, and Christians in African countries.
Now we all can see how she clearly moves the topic towards the cultural claim rather than religious. And listen to this carefully and watch Douglas being more honest and how he continues to hammer home the truth.
What we've achieved is as nothing. As for your second question, this is another way to evade it. I don't know any Jew or Christian who doesn't deny chapters in Leviticus.
Douglas made a compelling point, and we're all on board.
Okay? But I find it very, very commonplace, as we had this evening, that people ignore that the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, are pretty strong on the matter of what you do about the gays. So if we were to arrive at some kind of process of moving beyond that, you would have to start, wouldn't you, by saying, well, the authoritative books and collections of Bukhari hadith of Muhammad are not gay liberation documents, any more than they're women's liberation documents. You would start by admitting that, but we always go around the other way. We always go, no, it's a specific, it's a cultural thing. It's not to do with religion, it's to do with a particular tribal thing. Often then, it's, as we hear quite often about this, it's that the British and other colonial powers imported homophobia to the Muslim world, which otherwise was just great with us gays. And this also is not an accurate interpretation. So
back for Douglas for a sec. Douglas hits the bullseye, as rightly said. The Hadiths, collections of sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, contain strong stances on homosexuality. For example, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, two of the most respected Hadith collections, include sayings that prescribe severe punishments for homosexual acts. And we all must agree that anti-homosexual views are not unique to Islam. And even in many Muslim-majority countries, laws and social attitudes against homosexuality are influenced by religious teachings. As in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan, homosexual acts are illegal and can be punishable by severe penalties, including death in some cases. This demonstrates the significant influence of religious texts on contemporary legal and social norms. Now further, Douglas continues.
As I say, I would urge that Muslims in debating subjects like this admit what's in the texts and get beyond them fast. But I'm not a Muslim. They have to do the job themselves. I just hope they do.
Douglas Murray contrasts Western values like gender equality and LGBTQ+ rights with restrictive practices in many Islamic countries. He points out how laws rooted in Islamic teachings limit women's freedoms and criminalize homosexuality, contrasting sharply with Western norms. Murray emphasizes the need for honest discussions about these doctrinal issues to address extremism effectively. What are your thoughts? Comment down below, and do watch our latest fierce debate on how Douglas Murray silences Mehdi Hasan.